All right, so the first category of tasks that we're going to talk about here is transformational tasks. Now, transformational tasks are essentially when we have data in one format and we want to transform it into another format. So just to give you an idea of a few examples of this, you might have, let's say that you have an article, right? An article, maybe it's a news article. Well, there's a few things that you might want to do with that article, right? You might want to summarize the article, which would mean taking the full-length article, which might be several pages long, and condensing it down into a paragraph or two. Or you might want to take that article and convert it into a series of bullet points to describe the main points of the article, right? So, in both of these cases, this transformation has some very useful possible applications. If you were creating a news site and you wanted to have like a TLDR box up at the top above the article that showed the main points, being able to automatically perform these transformational tasks would be very helpful, since you wouldn't actually have to pay someone to read the articles and generate those for you. ChatGPT in general is pretty good at doing transformational tasks. So in other words, this is a really good candidate for something that you could use prompt engineering to, for the most part, automate. So anyway, that's the basic idea. Some other ideas for transformational tasks might be doing things like rewriting an article in a different writing style, rewriting an article in a different language. That's a more specific instance that we'll talk about in more detail later on. Doing things like translation. Or even doing things like rewriting it for different reading levels. If you know that if you want to start marketing your content, let's say to people from various different reading level groups, then you could always use transformational tasks to achieve that as well. So transformational tasks are incredibly useful things that ChatGPT can perform, mostly just because these things are so time intensive to do if you actually have a human doing them. So let's take a look at some of the bullet points for this slide. And these are really, again, just specific recommendations above and beyond the recommendations that we went through earlier in the course. So for transformational tasks, really the biggest thing that you're going to have to try and do is specify the desired transformation clearly as possible, because ultimately that's going to really influence the outcome and the result that you get. So this is a little bit more difficult than just being specific about, I want a meal plan for gluten-free vegans, let's say, as the example that we used previously went. It's because you're actually specifying something that's a little bit more complex. So again, going back to the example of taking a long article and summarizing it, well, summarize might mean different things. Do you want a summary that's half the length of the original article? Do you want a summary that's no longer than maybe 250 words? Do you want a summary that's no longer than 50 words? So being very specific about those things is going to be key as well. So another thing to keep in mind here is that it can often be very helpful when you're doing things like summarization or rewording things, or maybe shortening into bullet points. You really need to encourage ChatGPT in many cases to encourage the preservation of certain key pieces of information or key ideas in the work that you're transforming. All right, so for example, let's say that you're trying to shorten an article on something like a stock market crash, for example. Well, if you were going to convert that into a series of very short bullet points, you might want to keep different parts of that article or put emphasis on different parts of that article. So you might want to put emphasis on the effects that a stock market crash would have on ordinary middle-class people. You might want to, another possibility there would be focusing on the possible causes of the stock market crash. And those are going to give you very different pieces of output because of where you're telling ChatGPT to sort of focus its attention, right? So that's another very important thing to keep in mind with transformational tasks. And if you have the ability, providing examples is extremely helpful in this case. So again, let's say that you're working at a news site, right? A site that publishes news articles online, and you already have a lot of news articles that have been generated by hand, right? You have articles and summaries that have been generated by hand, that is. Well, if you can pass a few of those into ChatGPT just by copying and pasting them is the easiest way to do that in many cases, that's really going to get you some very good output in many cases right off the bat and enable you to automate that process potentially. Now, again, if you can provide examples, this can oftentimes make the other two bullet points not quite as important. They're still a good idea, but they can oftentimes make those not quite as important because ChatGPT can actually start to recognize the patterns that are taking place without you having to describe them specifically. So that's, again, a very interesting possibility there. If you happen to have examples lying around or are willing to create them yourself, that can get you very good results very quickly because it will automatically include things like elements of writing style, or the different information or themes that are preserved, things like that. So let's go through a few examples. We already discussed some examples of transformational tasks, so let's just go through these bullet points to see if there's any that I haven't covered already. Summarizing a long article into bullet points, we discussed that already. Converting a news story into a poem, here's an interesting idea. And this is actually one that I've used, interestingly enough, because personally I've always found that reading news articles can tend to be a bit boring and a little depressing. So I've actually found that converting them into a poem can make it a much more engaging process. And you can even do this with things like textbooks, right? If you happen to have a textbook that you can just copy and paste some of the contents from into ChatGPT, you can have it convert that into, let's say, a Romeo and Juliet style poem, and I'm willing to bet that that would be a little bit more interesting in many cases than just the plain old text, although in many cases perhaps also a little bit more difficult to understand. So that's the basic idea there. Those are a few examples. Another example would be doing something like translating an article that's full of technical jargon. So maybe an article that was aimed at nuclear physicists and translating it into something that normal people can read. Now, obviously, in this situation, you might end up losing a little bit of information, but these are nevertheless some very interesting possibilities for transformational tasks in ChatGPT.